Welcome back to our channel. There is a 76-year-old fisherman named Hitoshi Nakama who lives on a small island in Okinawa. He has been fishing the same waters near the Senkaku Islands for decades. He's been intercepted by Chinese Coast Guard ships. He's been forwarded to prosecutors. He was once fined for violating the Ship Safety Act. None of it stopped him. But in November 2025, something finally did. Not a storm, not a fine, not a Chinese patrol vessel. A quiet phone call from a Japanese government official telling him, unofficially, carefully, with no formal record, that maybe now was not the time to go out there. A fisherman on a small boat in the East China Sea was being asked by his own government to stand down. That moment tells you everything about where we are right now. On November 7, 2025, Japan's newly elected Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi appeared before the House of Representatives Budget Committee. An opposition member asked her a hypothetical question. What would Japan do if China used military force against Taiwan? What she said next triggered the most serious diplomatic crisis between China and Japan since the end of World War II. Takaichi said that if warships were used and force was exercised in the Taiwan Strait, that scenario could, by her assessment, constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. The specific legal threshold under Japan's 2015 security legislation that would allow Tokyo to exercise collective self-defense and potentially take military action alongside its allies, even without Japan being directly attacked. Now, to understand why this mattered so much, you need context. Japan's security doctrine for decades has been built on strategic ambiguity. Tokyo would privately acknowledge Taiwan's importance. It would quietly share intelligence. It would allow American forces to operate from Japanese bases. But it never, not once, publicly drew a line in the sand around Taiwan. That line was always left deliberately blurry. Both sides understood the blurriness was the point. Takaichi erased the blur. She didn't say Japan would fight. Legal analysts note her statement was conditional and measured. She was describing a scenario, not issuing a declaration of war. But in geopolitics, the line between a legal threshold and a political commitment is razor thin. China didn't read it as a legal nuance. China read it as a warning shot. Within days, China's consul general in Osaka, Shuijian, posted on X that, and I want to be precise here, dirty heads must be cut off. That comment, directed at the sitting Prime Minister of Japan, was so extreme that even Beijing was forced to address it publicly. Japan summoned China's ambassador and demanded action. China refused to reprimand Hui. That was November. Things escalated fast from there. What followed wasn't a single escalation. It was a coordinated pressure campaign hitting Japan on every front at the same time. Diplomatically, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, not to discuss the crisis, but to preemptively isolate Japan. He told London that Japan was exploiting Taiwan, territory it had colonized for half a century. He told Berlin that Tokyo was provoking and threatening China militarily. He was building a wall around Japan before anyone in Europe had a chance to decide whose side they were on. Economically, China hit Japan where it hurts. It issued travel warnings discouraging Chinese citizens from visiting Japan. Airlines offered free ticket changes on Japan-bound flights. Hotels and attractions in Japan reported mass cancellations. And then, on January 8, 2026, China moved to restrict exports of dual-use technology and rare earth materials to Japan, the same critical minerals that run Japan's semiconductor, defense, and automotive industries. Culturally, the signals were everywhere. A major Studio Ghibli exhibition in Guangzhou was canceled. A Pokemon trading card tournament in Shanghai was postponed. And in perhaps the most symbolic move of all, the two giant pandas at Tokyo's Ueno Zoo, Xiao Xiao and Lei Lei, were ordered to return to China ahead of schedule. Pandas are Beijing's most visible diplomatic tool. Their early departure was not logistical. It was a message. And militarily, on December 9th, China and Russia sent a message that was impossible to misread. Two Russian Tu-95 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons. 2 Chinese H-6 bombers, 4 Chinese J-16 fighter jets. They flew together through the Miyako Strait between Japan's main islands and entered the Pacific Ocean. This was not a routine patrol. Russia and China have conducted joint exercises before, but doing it specifically through Japanese airspace in the context of an active diplomatic crisis with Japan at this precise moment, that was deliberate communication. We are coordinated. We are watching. We are here. The United States responded within 24 hours. 2 B-52 bombers flew joint missions alongside Japanese F-35s and F-15s. Japan's defense ministry issued a statement reaffirming their resolve to prevent any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force. 2 nuclear-capable bomber formations on opposite sides flying through the same airspace within a day of each other. Over Japan. Let that settle in for a moment. Then came January 8th, 2026. 2 of China's most prominent government-linked think tanks, the China Arms Control and Disarmament Association and the China Institute of Nuclear Industry Strategy, jointly published a 29-page report. Its title, Nuclear Ambitions of Japan's Right-Wing Forces, a Serious Threat to World Peace. I want to be clear about what this report was and wasn't. It was not a classified leak. It was not a military intelligence assessment. It was a publicly released document published at a press event in Beijing, coordinated with statements from both China's Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry on the same day. This was a deliberate, synchronized public accusation, not a whisper from the shadows. The report's core claims that Japan's conservative political forces are pursuing nuclear weapons capability, that Japan has been stockpiling weapons-grade plutonium under the cover of its civilian nuclear program, and that the Takaichi government represents a dangerous revival of militarism. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning, at a press conference the same day, said Japan's right-wing forces were displaying nuclear ambitions and demanded that Tokyo immediately clarify its position on nuclear weapons. Now, is there any factual basis here? Japan has maintained its 3 non-nuclear principles since 1967. It will not possess, produce, or permit nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. That policy has been the cornerstone of Japan's post-war identity as a pacifist nation. 2 former Japanese prime ministers, including Kishida, publicly reaffirmed those principles after this controversy began. But here's what gives China's accusation traction. And here's where we need to be honest and precise. As of the end of 2024, Japan holds approximately 44.4 tons of separated plutonium, both domestically and stored overseas. That is enough in theory for thousands of nuclear weapons if it were ever weaponized. Japan has also been developing hypersonic glide vehicles with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. And in December 2025, a senior Japanese cabinet official, unnamed but confirmed by Japanese media, stated that Japan should consider acquiring nuclear weapons. The government quickly distanced itself from the comment, but it did not fire or formally discipline the official who said it. China watched all of that and drew its own conclusions. Whether those conclusions are legitimate strategic analysis or deliberate political pressure designed to isolate Japan internationally, that's a question worth sitting with. But the accusation is now out there, publicly, in an official document backed by China's foreign and defense ministries. That is a new reality in this crisis. Which brings us back to Hitoshi Nakama on his fishing boat and the 5 uninhabited islands at the heart of this entire confrontation. The Senkaku Islands, or the Diaoyu Islands, depending on which government is speaking, 5 small rocky outcrops in the East China Sea, 105 miles east of Taiwan and 254 miles west of Okinawa. No permanent residents, no infrastructure, believed to contain oil reserves. Japan has administered them since 1895. China has contested that claim with increasing aggression since the early 2010s. In 2025 alone, Chinese Coast Guard vessels entered waters Japan claims as its own 27 times and sailed through Japan's contiguous zone a record 357 times. That's nearly every day. Since November 2025, following Takaichi's Taiwan statement, Japanese fishermen have been quietly asked to stay away, not through a formal government announcement, through informal phone calls. Coast Guard officials telling fishermen now is not the time. A finance minister at a private meeting telling a fisherman, small incidents can grow bigger and lead to war. Think about that for a second. Japan is being asked by its own government to reduce its presence in territory Japan officially claims to control. Because Tokyo knows that if a Chinese Coast Guard vessel detains a Japanese fisherman right now, in this climate, the diplomatic consequences could spiral beyond anyone's ability to manage. In 2025, only 8 Japanese fishing vessels made documented visits to the Senkakus, down from 18 the year before, down from 164 in 1977. The islands China claims Japan controls are slowly being ceded, not through war, not through treaty, through the quiet accumulation of Chinese presence and Japanese restraint. Here is the structural danger that analysts and historians keep returning to. China and Japan do not have a crisis hotline. There are no regular military-to-military communication channels. There is no established de-escalation framework between Tokyo and Beijing if a confrontation starts near the Senkaku Islands, if a Coast Guard captain makes a bad decision, if a radar contact gets misread, if a fisherman gets detained. Both governments will be improvising in real time. We saw a preview of how quickly things can move in December 2025 when a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a Japanese Coast Guard vessel had a standoff near the islands. China claimed it had implemented necessary control measures and driven away a Japanese fishing boat. Japan said it had intercepted and expelled Chinese vessels that had approached one of its own. Two governments describing the same incident in completely opposite terms. No shared framework for resolving the contradiction. This is precisely how small conflicts become large ones, not because leaders want war, but because in the absence of communication architecture, each side interprets the other's actions through worst-case assumptions. And worst-case assumptions, when acted upon, create the very outcomes everyone was trying to avoid. History has a word for this. It's called the security dilemma. And right now, China and Japan are locked inside one. If you want to track where this crisis is heading, here are the specific indicators that matter. First, Japan's nuclear posture. Does PM Takaichi or any senior official make further statements about nuclear weapons or nuclear submarines? Even a hint of movement away from the 3 non-nuclear principles will trigger an immediate and severe Chinese response. Second, military exercises. The PLA's Eastern Theater Command already announced a major exercise around Taiwan in late December, codenamed Justice Mission 2025. Watch for any follow-up exercises that simulate amphibious operations. That is the most direct signal of Beijing's actual intent. Third, the Senkakus, day by day. Chinese Coast Guard vessel frequency, Japanese responses, whether fishermen return to those waters or continue to stay away. The islands are the most likely spark point for a physical confrontation. Fourth, rare earth exports. China restricting dual-use items to Japan is an economic pressure tool. If those restrictions expand or deepen, it signals Beijing is preparing for a long-term confrontation, not a short diplomatic episode designed to force a retraction. Fifth, U.S. involvement. Washington has been notably restrained in its public response to this crisis. The U.S. State Department made some statements. There were joint bomber flights, but nothing at the presidential level. Watch whether that changes and what conditions would change it. China and Japan are the second and third largest economies on Earth. Combined, they represent nearly a fifth of global GDP. A military conflict between them would not stay regional. Supply chains collapse, markets crash, energy prices spike. And the United States, bound by treaty to defend Japan, would face a choice no administration wants to make. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has moved the doomsday clock to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. The Asia-Pacific tensions we're describing right now are one of the primary reasons cited. None of this is inevitable. Wars rarely are, in retrospect. There are rational leaders in Beijing, Tokyo, and Washington who understand the catastrophic downside of miscalculation. Japan's public polling shows the majority of its population does not want military confrontation with China. China's economic relationship with Japan remains massive. No one benefits from war. But here is what history teaches us. The wars that no one wanted have a way of happening anyway. One phone call to a fisherman, a quiet request not to go to waters he has fished his whole life. A government so worried about a spark that it's asking its own citizens to yield ground in territory it claims to own. Something is changing in the East China Sea. And unlike the diplomacy happening in conference rooms, this change is happening on the water, one boat at a time.